ambassador to the Nordic countries, and ambassador to Canada. We have Dr. Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institute. Dr. O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research in foreign policy at the Brookings Institute, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He has authored many books and academic articles and is adjunct professor at Columbia, Georgetown University, and lectures at George Washington University. And he's also a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Honorable ambassadors, Dr. O'Hanlon, and our audience, thank you very much for being with us today. I would like to ask for opening remarks from our panelists, starting with Ambassador Javed Ludin, followed by Dr. O'Hanlon, and final remarks by Ambassador Ronald Newman. After these remarks, I will start today's session with a few questions that I have, and then we will open the floor for questions from our audience who are there with us via Zoom link from various locations around the world. Our audience, you can send your questions in the Q&A section from your Zoom windows. Ambassador Ludin, the floor is yours. And we talked about the topic, what it is. Would be great to hear your take on that. Thank you. Ambassador, your mic is mute.
Apologies. Well, thank you so much. It's really, really wonderful to see you, and thank you to the Center for Afghanistan Studies for this very timely event. I believe I think the relationship between Afghanistan and the US is one that among all the options that we have, we diplomats, or rather, I must say, former diplomats, of bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral relationships that we usually that we now busy ourselves with to study. And I think this perhaps is the least study. So I think I would encourage really the center to continue these very useful dialogues. I will obviously talk about as I assume the rest of the panel will, on the key process that brings Afghanistan and the US right now at an important juncture, and that is the peace process and the negotiations that are going on in Doha. For me as an Afghan, it's obviously very disconcerting to have the fate of my country being decided in a different capital in a very existential way. And Doha is that place right now. But before I talk about Doha, in fact, I'd like to maybe comment a little bit about a place where the fate of Doha is actually going to be decided. It's really the hierarchy of importance here, and that is Washington. You're going to have elections in the near future. I'm sure a lot of people around the world think it's quite unfair that the American people tend to decide who will be the president of the United States, and then will have as much, and that will have as much to do with the rest of the world as it would probably about the US. But it's the privilege of the American citizens, I suppose. For me, I think it's really important. There's a lot of there's a lot that's at stake in terms of the two candidates right now, and but a lot of people say, is there going to be a big difference whether Trump is reelected or Biden gets elected? And I think in Afghanistan, people generally don't seem to have a lot of concern about whichever it goes. But this time around, one thing that's very clear is that one reason that negotiations in Doha haven't made much progress recently is because they're both waiting for the outcome of the elections on November 3rd. The reason that is the case is because there's so much of the agreement that you mentioned, Sherjan, on the 29th of February. There's so much that centers around that, and that really is a Trump policy and a Trump legacy. And a lot of people think that if Biden wins, there may be, or the question of U.S. troops will probably, both sides will probably not have a whole lot of different approaches to the future presence of the U.S. in Afghanistan, but at least there will be a different approach to the peace agreement with Taliban. That's why I'm now going to the discussion on what's going on in Doha. As I said, one of the reasons that there isn't any progress so far is precisely the fact that that both sides, without admitting it, are actually waiting essentially for what the outcome of the U.S. presidential elections will be. Especially the administration in Kabul, the President Ghani and the Republican side, they think that there will be significant difference if Vice President Biden wins the elections. So we will see. I mean, I personally don't have much high hopes as far as difference in policy is concerned, but I think just as much as I can, the concern that I have for the role of the U.S. and not only in Afghanistan but just broadly in that part of the world, in the region, I believe President Trump's sort of isolationist approach is frankly quite dangerous. I think that's why a more sort of engaged U.S. is something, regardless of what they will do to the troops question in Afghanistan, is probably a more welcome development. Another reason, I mean, going to Doha, another reason that the negotiations are stalled is because I think both sides to the negotiations process are fundamentally unwilling. They'd rather they didn't have to do this deep down. Obviously, it's a process that's facilitated by the U.S., and I think both sides recognize the inescapable reality of it, that they have to be part of it, but if they could have avoided it, I'm sure both of the sides would have, and that's why they're both in a way waiting that other developments outside the region, including the U.S. elections, but also others, could sort of come in and sort of influence the situation. It is a little bit of sort of a worrying prospect there, because the way things look, even though both sides are equally unwilling, but I think the Taliban side is unwilling for a reason, and that is that if eventually the U.S. complete withdrawal takes place, then they may have a significant chance of a military victory, which makes the negotiations rather unattractive and quite meaningless as far as the Taliban are concerned. And that is why the Taliban, one of the reasons that we're seeing in a spike in violence, or the sort of continuation of violence, in fact, I don't for once buy the different labels that are assigned now, and all these violent incidents that are taking place are claimed by groups other than the Taliban. But I think regardless of what labels they put, fundamentally these all the extremist forces, including the Taliban, are sort of joined somewhere, joined up somewhere in the system. So I see a strategic point to this, and one of those points is the fact that they want to make sure that their rank and file, their troops, and their military coherence on the field is not affected by the negotiation process in Doha. The other objective, I believe, is also to test the commitment of the US to the letter and the spirit of the agreement that they signed with the Taliban on 29th, and particularly that one provision about the fact that the US, for as long as they're still in Kabul, in Afghanistan, that they would come to the rescue of the Afghan forces. And that's what I think the recent attack in Helmand was more than anything else. And this is going to get, unless some real new energy is sort of fed into this process in Doha, and to push the people towards a settlement, this is very dangerous, because this will have a spoiling effect on the process itself. Different people will try different things and test one side or the other, and in the absence of any meaningful progress in the peace process, then basically the effect of that will be, the accumulated effect of all these things will be a derailment of the process, and one never knows. This one came around with a lot of effort, and who knows when can we bring them back to the negotiation table. I will add that the introduction now of a role for a facilitator is a good development. I think anybody who thought that this could happen in the first place without the role of a facilitator, how they thought this was justified, because a complex process like this, in the way the Afghan tradition has never has never had any sort of experience of conflict resolution without the role of a third party, a mediation role. And this is not different. This shouldn't be different. I'll just make one last comment before we go to the other panelists and also the questions. And that is that, I think for one really because, if we think that the peace process in Afghanistan is to do primarily with Afghanistan and the United States, we may be mistaken, because I think the other party that has a major stake in this is the region. To the extent that the 40-year-old war in Afghanistan has had major regional dimensions, and has always had so, then the peace process itself is very much a regional project. The role of the US obviously was to bring it to this point, but there is a realization of the importance of the regional dimension. But I think this is one element that is still sort of underestimated a little bit. I think a lot of times, including in the current process, I have tremendous respect for Ambassador Khalilzad's work. I think he's done a great job bringing this to this point, in spite of a lot of criticism from many sides. But I think one thing that I do pick sort of an issue with is the regional approach so far. Because really, I mean, the better thing, rather than highlighting the role of the US, as an incentive or as a push factor to bring about regional consensus, a better approach would have been to actually highlight regional responsibility, regardless of the role of the US. Even if the US was completely uninvolved, the region would still have to own up to what's happening there, to own up the conflict, but also own up the outcome of the peace process. Because let's remember, I mean, even, it is going to be, if the peace process collapse, if Afghanistan does, God forbid, collapse into some sort of a civil war, it's not going to be a civil war in the normal sense of Afghans fighting each other for Afghan causes. The civil war in Afghanistan is going to take form of a regional proxy war, and the effect of that will be as damaging to the region as for Afghanistan it will be catastrophic, but it will also be for the region, and that's something that a reality that we have to highlight because sadly the region doesn't. They're still hung up in the sort of very much the proxy relationship. There has never been enough respect generated in the region for the Afghan state because they've seen it as an American project. So we have to do that. I know I've gone over my time, but those are some of the points I wanted to make at the outset, and then we'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. You pointed a number of issues that I'm sure we'll highlight in the questions. Dr. O'Hanlon.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be with my good friend, Ron Newman, as well as Ambassador Ludin and Sher John, and your excellent center there at the University of Omaha. Thank you for the privilege at this important time in U.S. politics, in American foreign policy, and certainly in U.S.-Afghan relations and the future of Afghanistan. I just want to begin with 4 points that have no particular common theme or thrust, but in the way of framing where I'm coming from, I thought they would be the most useful way to begin before hearing from Ambassador Newman and then going to our conversation. First, I think we Americans need to remember one central success in the almost 20-year effort in Afghanistan since 9/11. And on this point, I thank everyone on the phone call because you've all done so much directly and personally to achieve this outcome. The one central success is the United States has not been attacked again in a catastrophic way from South Asia since 9/11. There have been a couple of small attempted attacks. There have been a couple of copycat or lone wolf attacks that might have had some linkage to Afghanistan or Pakistan, but there has not been another big attack. This is the central concern of the United States in explaining why we went to war in the first place after 9/11, and therefore it is the single most important thing that we could have achieved, and we have achieved it. Now, you always want to say that with some degree of caution, trepidation, and awareness that things could change, and that we certainly don't have an end state that is somehow stable. So I acknowledge all those caveats, but it's very infrequently underscored that we have actually achieved our top goal as Americans. This is a selfish national interest US perspective, but I think it's worth reminding my fellow Americans that as frustrating as this mission has been, and as much as it's gone on longer and in a much more difficult way than many of us hoped or even predicted, nonetheless, it has so far achieved that central goal. Point one. Point two, the United States is now at roughly 5,000 US troops in Afghanistan, apparently headed for 4,500. I don't take seriously President Trump's tweet that all the forces should be home by Christmas. I think that was aspirational. And like many of President Trump's tweets, it was more where his gut was that morning as opposed to any plan. But I don't know what would happen if he were to win re-election, and I share the concern we just heard from the ambassador that in fact President Trump in a second term might feel empowered, vindicated, legitimated to pull out of Afghanistan, and for that matter, out of NATO, which is one of the reasons I hope that he is not re-elected. I don't want to run the experiment of seeing just how many of his gut instincts and desires he would actually translate into policy. if he felt vindicated by re-election. But I do know that 5,000 US troops is 95% fewer than we had at the peak of the surge when Ambassador Newman and I traveled frequently to Afghanistan on research trips. And it's even less, substantially less than the number we had when he was ambassador in the mid-2000s, in that period when the United States was so focused on Iraq and did not devote many resources to Afghanistan. But even then, we were in the range typically of 15 to 20,000 US troops. 5,000 US troops is sustainable. It's sustainable indefinitely in military, political, and budgetary terms. It doesn't mean we should do it, but we can do it. And there's really no mistake about that. And I think that point is worth harping on a bit, because quite often we talk about the need to somehow draw down in the Middle East. We already have drawn down in the Middle East dramatically. And while we should always want to minimize our overseas military presence as much as prudence allows, a 95% reduction is already pretty good. And I've advocated that we think about having 5,000 troops for 5 years, 5,000 US troops all the way through the next presidential term in the United States as sort of our default. Unless negotiations fundamentally change that situation, 5,000 for 5 years is a good mantra, a good going in premise for the United States. That's point two. Point three, the political pressure on either President Trump or Vice President Biden to pull out of Afghanistan is very low in the United States. We do not see people marching on the Mall on this issue. We see people marching on the Mall for 10 or 20 or 30 other issues in the United States, but this is not one of them. The intensity of American political feeling and passion on the Afghanistan subject is very, very modest. Now, I should acknowledge on the other side that the importance of avoiding a defeat in Afghanistan is probably also relatively low politically in the United States, as long as we're not attacked again by whatever might happen in Afghanistan after an American departure. So if President Trump or Vice President Biden were to pull out abruptly, as Trump has sometimes said he would, then in fact, even if Afghanistan collapsed, as long as we could find some kind of a regional perch for counterterrorism missions going forward, there might not be that much of a political price to pay in the United States. I'm not advocating that policy, but I'm acknowledging that Americans are frustrated by Afghanistan, and as much as they would be willing to stay with a few thousand troops, they also don't really expect a success if we stay. And therefore, I think if you could find some way to manage the falling apart of Afghanistan in a manner that did not seriously impinge upon America's core national security interests, Americans would tolerate it. And it would not be seen ultimately as a big hit against whoever is in the White House in the next 4 years. Now, that's a big if, because of course, if Afghanistan does fall apart, I have no doubt the Taliban still has close ties to al-Qaeda, that it might very well feel emboldened to then develop further, and we could be attacked again. So again, I'm not advocating that policy. I'm simply trying to give my sense of the politics of Afghanistan in the United States. And the summary statement is the politics are not that pressing. They are not that passionate, and it is not a top tier issue for the United States, certainly in this election. My very last point, and I'll stop, is that I think it's time, especially if Vice President Biden wins next week, but even if President Trump wins, I think it's time to clarify that the February 29th accord between the United States and the Taliban does not obligate the United States or NATO to leave Afghanistan with all troops by May of 2021. Many Taliban believe that's what the accord says. I have read that accord many times, as I'm sure everyone else on this phone call has. You all may have different interpretations. I look forward to hearing Ron Newman's interpretation in a moment. But when I read that package deal, not only does the February 29th agreement require the Taliban to break ties with al-Qaeda, which it has not done because it's still in cahoots with the Haqqani network, but also I read the four main provisions of the February 29 accord as interconnected, such that none of them are binding until all of them are achieved. And in the fourth and final point, there is a requirement for a dialogue, not just an initial conversation, but a dialogue that maps out a complete roadmap for power sharing in Afghanistan. Until we have that kind of a roadmap, I do not believe that the requirement for US and NATO forces to leave is binding on Washington. And I hope the Taliban can be disabused of their expectation that we feel the obligation to leave by spring of next year. As long as they feel that we will leave, regardless of the outcome of the election, then as the ambassador has already said, they'll have no incentive to negotiate seriously. And so I think we need to clarify that point because most people don't get it. I think it's crucial that we underscore we are not leaving. We are not leaving just because the Taliban have sat down once or twice in Doha and therefore think they have satisfied their obligations. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanlon. Thank you very much for the wonderful comments. Now let's go to Ambassador Roland Newman.
Thank you very much. It's also my pleasure, as well as my colleagues, to be here virtually in the Center for Afghan Studies. I first started talking to the center quite some years ago when your predecessor, Tom Goutier, was still in charge. You may know that my parents were godparents to his children.
Yes.
So the association goes back some ways. And it's a pleasure to be with you today and with my colleagues, Michael O'Hanlon and Javed Ludin. I think, try to keep this very short so we go to questions. Cutting to the most basic, what is the situation on the ground? A lot of violence, but the basic situation, the government is standing on the defense and pushing back when it is attacked. The Taliban is attacking and pulling back when it is repulsed. That is an unstable situation in which the Taliban has the space to gradually expand its control, not perhaps in the major cities, but of roads and districts. It is a very dangerous situation because it leaves the military initiative almost completely in the hands of the Taliban. And that, of course, is a situation that is exactly what Ambassador Ludin described, no incentive for significant compromise in a peace negotiation. That then brings us back to the role of the United States, because it is crucial, whether it can be good or it can be bad, it will be equally central because all the other players to some extent orient their policies on their expectations of the United States. As if the United States is unclear, they guess. And some of those guesses can be very dangerous. So I agree with Ambassador Ludin that it would be very nice if the regional states would take a stronger role, but they won't. They're unlikely to, for a lot of reasons that I won't go into now, but particularly if they are unsure of where the U.S. is. And everyone is unsure of where the U.S. is. We are not demonstrating any continuity of policy. And this is very destabilizing. So we have an agreement. I agree with Dr. O'Hanlon, does not require us to be out by May of next year. However, we have no credibility on that point. You had Secretary of Defense Esper, Secretary of State Pompeo saying a few months ago when the agreement was signed in February, this is conditions based. Well, first of all, we have very little credibility going in on the idea of conditions, because that's what we said in the Obama administration when we were doing the withdrawal from the surge. And in fact, that withdrawal was driven much more by timelines. So that the world did not begin when the Trump administration took office. The credibility of the United States, particularly on the phrase conditions-based, was already low. And it has now been seriously undercut again by, first of all, a more accelerated initial troop withdrawal, which was partly driven by COVID, and then a further acceleration now with the president talking about even more rapid acceleration. All this simply undercuts the idea that is in the agreement that we don't have to pull all the troops out if nothing is happening. So that then brings us to the question of what to expect after the election. And that is, of course, very difficult to answer. I totally agree with Dr. O'Hanlon that this is not a big political issue in the United States. I think it is very difficult often for our Afghan friends to understand just how irrelevant Afghanistan is in American politics. Afghanistan, after all, is central to their lives and their futures, and the United States is a huge piece of this. And how can the United States not be paying attention to this? Well, there's some like me who are very sorry about that. But the fact is, Americans do not care about Afghanistan. It has not been discussed in the election, was not much discussed in the election 4 years ago. Uh, so the good news is that there is no big political pressure to take the United States out, and the bad news is that there is very little political pressure to keep it engaged in Afghanistan. The president and whoever the next president is will have actually great freedom to do whatever they want. Now, if it's the case of Mr. Biden, what do we know? We know he would just as soon prefer to be out, doesn't like being in Afghanistan, but we also know, one, that he believes any withdrawal has to be responsible, and two, he has talked about the desirability of a small counterterrorist force. So I would say that absent a peace settlement, the odds are that something will remain with the Biden administration. Can't guarantee it. What you probably can guarantee with the Biden administration is that you will have a more stable policy once they have gotten by their initial review of what the policy ought to be. They are likely to be more consistent, and you won't have these swings of we're going one direction, no, we're going another direction. Actually, we think we like the first direction, which have characterized the Trump administration and been so incredibly destabilizing. I think it's also useful to remind people that when it, or if it is Biden, he is going to be preoccupied initially, first of all, with appointments to his government, and second, with a large number of problems that will come before Afghanistan. Obviously, the COVID panic, the American economy, the basic framework of our relations with Russia and China. So I would not expect that a Biden administration will make any fundamental decisions about Afghanistan for some time. It will take them some time to get to where they even think about it. And that will cause confusion also because Afghans will be trying to read into actions a policy which will not yet have been reflected upon. If it is Trump, God knows, because Trump will not have an electoral promise to keep in the same way. He will be in a second term. He won't have to worry about a re-election because he can only be in office 2 terms. So whether it is important to him to take the rest of the troops out, I have no idea. He functions on a basis of what is important to him in American domestic politics and on sort of basic instincts. He has had one problem all along, which is that he wanted to get out and he did not want to be in charge for a disaster. He did not want to be responsible for a disaster. Now, as he gets closer to the election becomes all that counts for him. But if he is reelected, then he has another 4 years in which he does not want to be responsible for the disaster. So I would say you can't predict that man. You could see that he would decide, well, I'll keep the least I can so that I don't have a disaster. And you could guess that he will suddenly decide, the hell with us, I'm tired of Afghanistan. You really can't tell. What can Afghans do about this? Well, there is one thing, because there is one point that is you will find very strong in Biden. You'll find it now in Trump, and you find it in all the other international donors. And that is great unhappiness with the poor quality of Afghan governance and with the high level of corruption. And I would predict that no matter who is president, you will see economic aid go down because donors are unhappy and angry with the performance of the Afghan government. Unfortunately, in times like this of great uncertainty, the incentive for people will be to grab and plunder whatever they can because they don't know what the future brings. And that's perfectly logical. But the performance of the Afghan state will in fact be the one factor Afghans, politicians, political leaders could control, which would actually have an impact on the foreigners, on America, on NATO, on the donor countries. If they actually believed that they were seeing an Afghan government that was taking charge of its country in those terms, instead of presiding over a division of spoils, then that would trigger a renewed commitment to Afghanistan. I don't believe it will happen. It has not happened in the last 5 years. Certainly didn't beforehand. But if Afghans want to think about what is it Afghans can do to affect policy, it is to clean up and improve the quality of their government.
Absolutely. Ambassador, thank you very much. Before I ask questions, I would like to remind our audience that they can submit questions, and they've already done, starting that, their questions into the Q&A section of their Zoom link. Ambassador Ronald Newman talked about what the Afghans can do to change the policy or affect the U.S. policy in overall aspect. My question is to Ambassador Javed Ludin. You talked about spoilers, things don't go right, and how the region could be approached by United States, and how the effort that could be promoted within the region that a weaker Afghanistan is not in their interest, and how that could be promoted. What is your take on that one? How we could engage the region with the U.S. leadership and the Afghan government leadership? What would be the scenarios and efforts that could benefit sustaining a long-term peace?
Thank you. Well, the region simply, I mean, it is what's going on in Afghanistan is part of a regional war in every sense of the way. Whether you look at it as a threat that affected the U.S. Almost 20 years ago and led to the U.S. intervention, that was something that wasn't really an Afghan phenomena, literally speaking, and still is. I mean, it still is that threat to the extent that we are still fighting it in various forms, Taliban, different labels, Al-Qaeda, and now obviously IS or Daesh. These are all global/regional challenges, and Afghanistan is rather a victim of it rather than a producer. But we do, obviously, to the extent that any country that has ungoverned spaces, that's led by a weak or failing state, which Afghanistan was the case 20 years ago, still, in fact, is a weak state, if not a failed state. Then we do end up serving as a space for those forces to act from. But I think also in other ways as well, right now, because the region is in itself has historically been divided by geostrategic facts. It's one of the most fragmented region in the whole world. That the response is always to the Afghan conflict of the years has been one of serving proxy, acting through proxy Afghan forces and sort of containing the Afghan rather than trying to solve it, and I think it's right now the region. This could have been. I mean, the peace process not could have been, it still is, in fact, the best, literally the best opportunity, not only to once and for all finish the Afghan conflict. I don't agree with a lot of Afghans who think that this, that there is alternative to the current peace process. Maybe it's not a desirable situation we are in it, but we cannot escape it. This is really the make or break for Afghanistan, moment for Afghanistan. So to that extent, this could, I mean, what the US should do, I believe, in terms of its engagement with the region, is to actually make that point very strongly, very forcefully, that this is a regional situation. And I think the region has a responsibility to Afghanistan, but also to its own citizens to get its act together. The region should be, rather than, sort of having these deals with big powers, approaching Russia, then China, and then making these side deals, the best thing is to actually facilitate a region-wide consensus that will not only guarantee the current process to succeed, but also the end state. And the region should actually know what's at the end of this for them, and they should be convinced that that serves their core interests.
Well, thank you very much. This is great. And also, what are the potential spoilers? I know ISIS and many other groups, the regional rivalism, how bad it could get if this deal is stalled or the talks go long. In a few short words, what do you think of that?
I mean, we need a really bigger conversation for this, because my own fear is that this could, if the peace talks collapse and if the US is out of the place, because I think the US, even with I very much agree with Dr. O'Hanlon's remarks about leaving a space leaving some American presence there. That would be very valuable, because I think that to the extent that there is some US presence, that would not necessarily guarantee a better end state for Afghanistan, but it will certainly guarantee the continuation of the process, the peace process. And that's something that we vitally need.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some continued US presence is number one. Number two is that then going back to my point about the region the region is the one actor, and I'm using it in sort of pluralistic, monolithic sense, which it is not, but actually that's where we should unite the region behind this. And the region is the one that can guarantee the end state, that can guarantee that Afghanistan will not go back to war. And what the Afghans can do is to just basically grasp this opportunity. Otherwise, I think what will happen is that the elements are already there. A lot of regional countries already have links with their potential proxy actors within Afghanistan. So if the US is out and if the peace process collapses, then I think what we're going to see is that proxy actors will start. The civil war will be in the form of proxy wars, not sort of north-south ethnic conflict.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Holland, you do research on foreign policy and defense analysis. You talked about the 5-5 option for Afghanistan, where the US could leave 5,000 forces for the next 5 years. That signifies the geostrategic importance of Afghanistan in the US policy. How do you explain further to our audience? There's a question by audience, how geostrategically important Afghanistan is in a very unfriendly neighborhood for the United States?
Right, and I entered a response that I hope will not come across as disrespectful, because from an American national security point of view, I do not believe Afghanistan is that centrally located in our broader international set of concerns. When we think about China and the rise of China, we think primarily about what China can do in East Asia. That's the part of the world we're most worried about China's actions. And Afghanistan is very far away from East Asia and the Western Pacific region. When we think about Russia, we're concerned primarily about how Russia behaves in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet space, coming down into the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. This is not, again, where Afghanistan is located. I don't want to say Afghanistan is unimportant, but I do think that it is remote. And from an American national security point of view, the most important thing about Afghanistan is what happens in and from Afghanistan itself, as well as neighboring Pakistan. Those are the core areas. And frankly, they are important enough to justify an ongoing American commitment and presence. In fact, very few people would have predicted 20 years ago that Afghanistan would be the place from which America's most grandiose twin towers would be felled in a terrorist strike that killed 3,000 people. That thought would have been almost unimaginable. And strategists would have said, if you imagine that scenario, you are dramatically overstating the importance of Afghanistan. And unfortunately for us, we were wrong in that assumption that we could just walk away from Afghanistan after the Soviets were driven out in 1989. So I don't think that Afghanistan is central. I don't think it's a top tier country for current American national security interests, but I do think it's still important in its own right because of what can happen from and near Afghanistan proper, especially Afghanistan and Pakistan. To me, that's reason enough that if we're down around 5,000 troops, that's a reasonable American footprint for matching to the scale and significance of the strategic importance of that region.
Absolutely, and you talked about the possibilities of such vacuums being created and utilized by other groups. So I think we saw that in Levant and in Iraq and Syria. What happened? We had to go back, and we did see this in 1992 in Afghanistan. So in the long term, there are quite potential threats that could emanate from that region. I'm going to go to Ambassador Ronald Newman. Question about you talked about wonderful points. I would like to talk about the leadership the U.S. is supposed to show that we sort of lack to show in the region, especially when we talk about our allies, because the U.S. policy is not just the U.S. policy about Afghanistan. It's going to be it has impacts on our allies, the NATO and many other countries in the region. Also, because everybody look at us, the United States. What the U.S. does, they respond accordingly. What do you think? The next president should have a policy options on that?
Well, you have two very different approaches. Obviously, Mr. Trump is American-centric, and he does not seem to be very concerned with maintaining long-term relationships. He is very much a kind of businessman that looks at every relationship as a transaction now, and you get a good deal or you don't get a good deal, and you move on, rather than as part of a long-term relationship, which has been the more traditional American approach to policy. If you have Vice President Biden is elected, then I think you will have a return to a good deal of importance being placed on longer-term relationships, institutions, and alliances. But it is a different world now than it was 4 years ago, and they will have to think that through. As we were talking about Afghanistan, I think it is important to remember that there are reasons that it makes it important to America, but they are not, first of all, they are not about bases. That is a very 19th century view, deeply believed by many Afghan friends, that we want bases in Afghanistan. America, I cannot tell you how strongly, I don't know how to tell you more strongly, America does not care about having bases in Afghanistan for power projection. That is a very Afghan view. It's a very 19th century view, and it is completely irrelevant to understanding American thinking. America does want, a lot of Americans do want some troops in Afghanistan, but they want them for a negative reason. They want them for things that they want to prevent, not for something they want to achieve. This is a very big difference. So what are the things they want to avoid? First of all, there is the potential for Afghanistan to be a central location for instability spreading out into Pakistan, into Central Asia, if Afghanistan begins to go into this kind of phase we've called a civil war. You have the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, you have Uyghurs that menace China, you have various other groups, and you have Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, for instance, which menace Pakistan, even if the Pakistanis don't pay any attention to it. And because you have the potential of drawing in Iran, Russia, Pakistan, obviously, to support local actors. You have also spreading possibilities of destabilization. And destabilization is something America does, at least American policymakers worry about. Most Americans don't think about it. You have a second issue, which is that this is where America's war with Al Qaeda began. And if America gives up in Afghanistan, then that is a great victory for those who believe in violent jihad, whether it is Al Qaeda or whether it is the Islamic State. That will be proof that God is on their side, and I think we will pay a very large price. But these are strategic rationalizations which probably 95% of Americans do not pay any attention to at all.
Right.
And so I'm simply describing a situation
Absolutely.
as it is.
Absolutely. You talked about wonderful things, the American public identifying what are they important for them. You talked about Al Qaeda and ISIS and many other terrorist groups in that region that could benefit from such a vacuum. And right now, the US Taliban deal insisted on Taliban severing their contacts with Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda affiliated groups such as Haqqani and other groups. So I'm going to go to Michael on question: where does the Haqqani network fit in this equation? They have not severed contacts with them, and they're still active. Previously, they were called the veritable arm of the ISI. Where do they fit in this whole equation? How do we approach that?
Well, I think that we're in a little bit of a paradox, to put it mildly. We are giving the Taliban some degree of leniency on what on its own terms should be viewed as a blatant violation of the spirit and letter of the February 29th Accord. The Haqqani Network is a terrorist organization with very close ties to Al Qaeda and actually very anti-American and anti-Western aspirations, not only anti-Afghan government aspirations, as proven by the many attacks it's carried out in Afghanistan over the years that have targeted Westerners and embassies and other places. So my interpretation of the Haqqani Network is that the only thing we could say that would justify this degree of leniency in tolerating Taliban ties to the Haqqani Network, and in fact, Haqqanis being in the Taliban leadership, would be 2 points. One, we have no choice because it's a reality. And second, at least they haven't tried to attack us in the United States or in the broader Western world in a way that we could directly attribute to the Haqqani Network itself. So it's sort of a polite fiction that gives us some wiggle room in peace talks, but it is a big stretch in terms of its relation to reality. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to remind the Taliban that this is just one of many reasons why it's not very plausible to think we're going to leave in May of 2021 just because they've sat down 2 or 3 times and had a couple of cups of tea with a delegation from the government in Doha.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Ludin. As a final question of today's hour, I'd like to see, the incentive you talked about the Taliban have or might not have to sit and continue talks. What are the chances that they would say or get fed up with this whole scenario and give up or continue to talk to Afghanistan? What could be done by the Afghan side to make it happen when we see all these uncertainties coming up?
I mean, the Taliban have a very different perception of what perhaps Afghans in the US side think about the peace process. They see it, they may not say it so much in the news out of politeness, but they see this essentially as an American way of negotiating a withdrawal from Afghanistan. And they see that fundamentally as a triumph for them of their jihad. That's how they communicate it to their own ranks and file. That's how, and also that's precisely how what influences their attitude at the negotiation table in Doha. So they are not in a hurry at all. They're not frustrated. They actually have all the time They have patience. In fact, the Republican side is the one that's frustrated, that's impatient, that wants to get something meaningful from this process before the deadline of the Doha agreement expires. So my sense is that the Taliban would like to just buy time, hope that the elections in November in the US will not fundamentally change the commitments that the US made in that agreement, in that there will still be an American withdrawal. They have actually, as as was said earlier in the conversation, they have taken a lot of sort of the initiative on the military front on the field, but they also have gained a lot politically from engagement in the countries of the region. A lot of countries in the region now have their own dedicated channels of communication with them. So they see themselves as really essentially as an incoming power. They haven't hidden it. In fact, a lot of people in Doha that are there say that privately over cups of tea in the lobby, in the corridors of the hotel, not in the negotiating room, they are telling the Afghan side, the Republican side, look, you had this for the last 19 years. Now it's our turn. This was taken from us by force anyway. So I think it's and I think one last point I make is that if this was truly a negotiation that would preserve some of the core aspects of the Republic and some of the gains, very valuable achievements that were made in the last 20 years, I wouldn't be worried about how the power sharing would look like and what role would the Taliban play in a future dispensation. I wouldn't personally be worried about.
Absolutely.
But sadly, that's not the case. Sadly, I think the Taliban have not changed. I have not seen anything to suggest that they have. The only thing that they will that will represent some change will be if the U.S., the international community, and the region will ensure that the Taliban come in a different sort of become part of a power sharing, not in a way that would mean that they can do what they want.
Absolutely.
That would be the only change that would force them to then adopt a more sort of lenient, a more political approach to power rather than a sort of a brutal military approach to power.
Absolutely. Tagging along with that comment, I just want to ask one more possible question. Please bear with me. We are at the max of the hour. Coming back to Ambassador Ron Newman on the region approach, Ambassador, how Taliban are based in Pakistan. Their leadership is there. What would the U.S. leadership take on disincentivizing Taliban or Pakistan in continuing violence or continuing with what's going on right now? How could that affect or impact their thinking and where they should be ready to go ahead with talks with the Afghan Republic team in Doha? What would you suggest to next administration, how to take it just to put an end to this long-term 19-year conflict in Afghanistan? Can the United States influence Pakistan further? Are there any incentives for that?
Quite honestly, the United States has a dismal record of influencing Pakistan. There have been a whole series of cycles of American pressure on Pakistan for one change or another. And usually the Pakistanis have managed to resist fundamental change, and the United States gives way. It is possible that there may be a place where the United States can put so much pressure on Pakistan it will change its view. I know many Afghans believe that. I personally do not think that is realistic. I think the Pakistan generals are perhaps incorrect about how central Afghanistan is to them, but they believe it. That means the level of pressure required to get them really to change would be enormous. It would really have to threaten the Pakistani state, because the Pakistani generals see what they are doing as part of their national security approach. I don't see America putting that level of pressure on, particularly because America doesn't, looks at Pakistan, sees a big country, an important country, and a country with nuclear weapons, and it does not want to see Pakistan break apart. So America, at the end of the day, will not put a level of pressure on Pakistan that is severe enough to force the Pakistanis to change. Now, what can bring about change is if the Pakistanis ever come to believe that America is prepared to sustain Afghanistan.
Okay.
That is something they have never believed. Years ago, I think it was General Kayani who said to then General Allen, I think you're going to leave and you'll leave a mess and we'll have to clean it up. And that has been the Pakistani view of America for years, that we will give this up, we will leave it, and it won't be fixed. And therefore, they want their own hand in the game. That view will only change if you have a sustained American policy. Dr. O'Hanlon's approach, 5,000 for 5 years, and stop thinking about it. Just acknowledge that it would be great if you had a peace process, but we don't see any seriousness in the peace process from the Taliban. And we think this is too important for us to leave. So we're going to have the lowest commitment we can that allows the Afghan state to soldier on. And then just stop worrying about it. If you're an American, obviously you can't stop worrying about it if you're an Afghan living in the middle of threats. But America has to stop constantly changing its policy and thinking about its policy if it wants anybody else to believe that its policy will last in one direction. And that is the one thing that could bring change to Pakistan, I think, if they really believe we're going to sustain this. But my personal belief is that there is not a level of pressure that America is willing to put on that would bring about a change in Pakistan. I know my Afghan friends will disagree with that.
Thank you. I think Ambassador Ludin wanted to add something here before we end up, please, sir.
No, it's just that I wanted, before you just conclude, there's a point that Michael mentioned in the chat about a partition as a scenario if everything fails. And as I said, catastrophic as it will be, the prospect of failure of the peace process, and coupled with disengagement by the United States and Europe, and then also combined with a lack of initiative and continued fragmentation at the regional level, then what you're going to have is, as I said, proxy wars and catastrophe. But if the Taliban, but one scenario is that if the Taliban do take over, do win, it's very unlikely that they will, at least in the near and medium term, that they will target other ethnic groups. I think they've already shown a lot of sort of interest in reaching out to other leaders. They are they're speaking, in fact, quite regularly with the types of Ustad Mahaqiq and Khalili and Dostum and Atta and Dr. Abdullah even. I think their main, they will see the main threat as, the Pashtun moderate leaders. They will be the ones that will be unacceptable and intolerable. And so I think to that extent, then partition along sort of fundamentally along ethnic lines will probably not be the near-term fear. But in the long term, yes, in the long term, if this continues, then what we're going to see is the emergence and spread of sort of proxy factors, which could eventually mean that threat, but not in the near term.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Dr. Ambassador Ludin. We have experienced that in the 90s, the chaos, the small fiefdoms of everybody in the 90s. And agree with you. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for the wonderful conversation. What I get from this whole discussion is first, the sustained U.S. presence and support for Afghanistan is an important factor of keeping Afghanistan and disincentivizing spoilers, whoever they are, regional or small, to spoil this whole process, because it's going to come back and bite America back sometime in the future. I hope not. But at the same time, it's Afghanistan that has to take more responsibility of cleaning the house, of providing good governance and all the aspects of what Afghans need in terms of from a typical government. And I think in the long term, I see no incentive for Taliban if they want to rule Afghanistan in one way or another one. They don't have to rule on the ruins. This is Afghanistan. It is different from 19 years ago, which is completely different in the youth, in the thoughts and political ideologies, and everything you can see is way different than what they had made in the 19 years ago. I appreciate your take on this one. This has been a great discussion. We had wonderful questions from our audience, but I think we don't have enough time to address all of these great questions. This is 1 hour debate, and more than 1 hour, I would say. Thank you very much for staying with us. And audience, thank you all for wonderful questions and participation in this one. This has been great. Appreciate your support for our work. I hope we meet again at the next post-election, post-US election debate on what's going to happen next. Whoever wins the US election next week. So that's going to be a big change for all of us, not just the United States, but Afghanistan also. Appreciate again. Thanks for the time you spent with us. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you. Have a good day.